coming up on Wednesday, July 7th, we will mark the 5th anniversary of the deadly ambush in downtown Dallas that claimed the lives of 4 Dallas police officers and 1 DART officer. The lone sniper who carried out the attack targeted police during a peaceful protest of police. Now, in the aftermath of that horrific ambush, we came together as a community to honor those who gave their lives while serving and protecting, and to honor all first responders. As we mark yet another anniversary of that deadly attack, I wanted to highlight the work of law enforcement and how North Texas police departments have dealt with the scrutiny that they have come under and the rise in crime. Joining me on the phone today is Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He is an associate dean and professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Dr. Del Carmen trains officers from coast to coast. Dr. Del Carmen, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Last year at this time, Dr. Del Carmen, the country, of course, was dealing with not only the pandemic, but also with racial justice protests following the death of George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin, who just last week was sentenced for his part in the death of George Floyd to 22 and a half years. How, in your opinion, has policing changed in the past year, and not just because of the pandemic, but in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd?
Yeah, so this is a great question, right? So if you look back at the past, really 3 to 4 years, law enforcement across the United States has been in a transitional stage of really sort of reevaluating themselves and trying to figure out what components should change and how they should be modified. But I think many of us agree that May 25th, 2020, the day that Mr. Floyd died, was a game changer for the entire nation, right? So many people began to see what happens when you have a police officer that is simply not well trained, perhaps ill-intended, and in addition to that, commits a crime in front of other people, other officers, and other bystanders that are simply watching, and they can't interfere in some cases, right? So I think what we began to see was this sort of self-exploration, if you want to call it that many of the chiefs of police throughout the state of Texas, and many of them are here in the North Texas region, that are very innovative, that are go-getters, that are not afraid of really asking the tough questions. They began to pose those questions as to what can we do better? Is our training really good enough? Are these police policies that we have in place, how do they translate once the officer is out in the streets? And how can we ensure that we hold everyone accountable while at the same time protecting the lives of the police officers that are risking their lives every day? So I'm proud to tell you that many of those agencies, some of whom I work with here in the North Texas region and throughout the state of Texas, have really embraced that change and used it as an opportunity to really embark in that self-exploration, inner look at their police department and embrace that change with courage and vision.
As someone who teaches criminal justice and law enforcement, how do you use what happened to George Floyd and to other people of color? How do you use that as a teaching tool for people studying criminal justice and law enforcement?
One of the things that we often say is, just because it is allowed, it doesn't mean that it has to happen, right? Just because you can, it doesn't mean that you should, is what we teach police officers. And, the old rule of saying, well, is this within the legal parameters of a particular police action, and if it is, then it's okay. That's no longer applicable. Nowadays, our thinking in policing is, there are circumstances that police officers have a great deal of discretion over, and is it really worth chasing a suspect because they tossed away garbage outside their window? Is it really worth engaging in a use of force incident because you're having an ego exchange with somebody who is being disrespectful to you? And so at the end of the day, our thinking is, engage when necessary, engage when the individual is posing a risk to society and to themselves and to the officer, but choose your battles, right? Don't go in there and start engaging in an enforcement action on a crime that perhaps be so minor and so insignificant that you could give somebody easily a ticket and they not necessarily have to take him into custody. We're not suggesting not to enforce the law, We're simply suggesting to enforce it in a way that it is commensurate with the actual event that took place, and to ensure that it doesn't escalate to the point that we saw, in Mr. Floyd's case, where allegedly he had used, a bill that was counterfeited. Whether he knew about it or not still remains a question. And the question is it really necessary to handcuff someone, put him in the back seat of the car, and then take him outside and put your knee on top of them? I mean, obviously the answer to that is no.
What part does adrenaline and anger play when police officers react in that circumstance where they are going to kneel on someone or do bad policing? Because I see it on the videos, thanks to social media. A lot of this is captured now on social media and posted for the entire world to see. But what part are you teaching your students about the part that adrenaline and anger plays?
Yeah, so oftentimes, we call the law enforcement profession, I've actually called it this in some of my writings, where I've said that it is 100 hours of boredom and 1 second of terror. Oftentimes, police officers find themselves in the mundane task of writing police reports and having to write traffic tickets and various other things that are simply mundane, bureaucratic, and at best, not necessarily adrenaline-based. But then there's also that 1 second of terror, where a police officer is bound in his or her lifetime to encounter situations and individuals that are incredibly aggressive, that are threatening of their lives and the lives of other people. And that adrenaline begins to flow. And oftentimes, what we hope for when we train them at police academies, and we train them as part of the in-service training that I've done, and I've trained over 15,000 police officers in the past 24 years now. And I can tell you that, we train them and retrain them and repeat the training again. So with the hope that when they go out there and they encounter these situations, the adrenaline will be managed. In other words, it's still there. We want them to have that adrenaline because we want them to be on the lookout. We want them to be cautious. We want them to protect their lives and the lives of other people. But we also don't want the adrenaline to supersede logic, to supersede the law, or to somehow obscure judgment. And that's where the key factor comes in, which is we want to have these officers so well trained that it becomes muscle reflex. In other words, that they respond to the event in a way that is systematic, uniform with the law, consistent with best police practices, and that they don't disengage from that training and begin to do things that are illegal, unethical, and simply fall outside the norm of best police practices. So we have to keep that in check, and it's very difficult sometimes, particularly with people that are new to the job and that, feel the adrenaline rush for the first time and simply forget the training when they face that 1 second of terror.
Yeah, and also training them to get home safely back to their families. So there are so many things that are involved in that split second.
Absolutely, right? So I often say that we, many of us look at law enforcement, as the defenders of the Constitution, right? The folks that enforce the Constitution every day. They are, in fact, much needed in our communities. It's a very noble profession. I've had the misfortune of losing 2 of my former students in the line of duty, and I can tell you, as someone that understands the pain of losing someone that you care for a great deal in the line of duty, that, their jobs are risky. I mean, these are folks that leave their homes every day, say goodbye to their families, and they literally do not know if they're going to see that family member at the end of shift. And so we want them to come home safely. We want them to be safe, and we appreciate all that they do for the rest of us to be able to exercise our freedoms. And as we celebrate the 4th of July, we oftentimes think about the courage that it takes for them to be able to preserve that Constitution and that independence that we value so much in the United States. But at the same time, we also want them to be within the framework of the Constitution. For as George Washington once said, our nation is a nation of laws.
My guest once again on the phone today, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, an associate dean and professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Dr. Del Carmen trains officers coast to coast, and we're focusing today on law enforcement issues as policing continues to come under scrutiny and crime is on the rise across the country as we come out of the pandemic. I wanted Dr. Del Carmen to join me to talk about what law enforcement agencies are doing to tackle crime in today's environment. You know, there's been a lot of talk over the years about community policing. Does it make an impact and are you seeing neighborhoods come together in working with police instead of working against them and seeing them as the enemy?
Yeah, you know, there's been a bit of a shift in the past few months after we had, last year's unfortunate campaign to defund the police, where many people were simply confused, in my judgment, that somehow they felt that police, on the one hand, needed to be improved, but on the other hand, they wanted to remove the funding, right? It makes no sense that you remove funding and resources from an institution that you feel needs help, right? But having said that, we knew, and I said this last year on the record, and I said it again earlier this year, that at the end of the pandemic, or what seems to be the end of the pandemic, that we were going to see a rise in the crime index. And of course, summers are typically, the era or the season of the year where we do see an increase of crime regardless of that. But if you really take note of the past year, what we've seen is sort of the perfect storm, right? People have lost their jobs. Many people were quarantined for 18 months plus. And then in addition to that, you had the effect of losing loved ones, right? Which obviously does affect the core of who we are. So when you add all of those ingredients, and then on top of that, the lack of popularity and support towards police, which did have an effect. Just a few weeks ago, we saw that someone from, I think it was a total of 50 police officers from the city of Portland just walked out on the job. And so when you see that across the United States, you then obviously can only predict that crime is going to go up. Now, having said that, some communities are beginning to realize that they need their police and they need to appreciate the work that police does on a daily basis, and they have begun to engage with the law enforcement community to be able to get rid of crime, which I'm really, really happy to see. But it is a long road ahead. It is almost a necessity to have a reset button in many ways with community relations as it relates to law enforcement, and we have a way to go in order to be able to be where we were prior to the pandemic.
You mentioned the police officers in Portland, and that was in reaction to charges being brought against an officer because of his actions during a riot. And I know in Buffalo, they did the same thing. Police officers en masse quit because of a reaction to their actions during a riot, during the protests. A lot of police officers are opting to leave law enforcement because of the environment that we're in right now, Dr. Del Carmen. What are you hearing from departments here in North Texas about the need for police officers and about what they should expect?
Well, part of the problem is that we're losing people with a great deal of experience and seniority. It's not just that we're losing officers, it's that we're losing officers with a great deal of experience. And what that means is that you have to ask the question as we hire young millennials to come into the ranks of law enforcement, who is going to mentor these folks, right? Who is going to train them on the job or in the field? And so what we hear here in Texas, and it's no exception to the rest of the United States, is that they're burned out, that they feel underappreciated, that they're tired of dealing with the scrutiny and some of the oversight that in some cases is necessary, but in other cases is not. And so what's happened is that many of them are saying, you know what, I've got, 6 months to go until I'm eligible to retire. I'm going to finish my 6 months and then I'm going to walk away from the job. And in some other cases where you see these protest exits, that we saw in Portland and Buffalo, what you find is that police officers find that they're in a situation where if they are in fact, questioned as to the use of force that they used in what they perceive to be a reasonable circumstance, that they may end up losing not only their reputation, but their freedom and all their savings, right? And all the money that they have saved up or worked really hard towards in the past 20 plus years. So many of them are making that mental equation of saying, you know what, I better walk away now and get a little bit of a pension versus sacrificing, everything that I've saved, my freedom, my stability, my family, for the sake of doing my job in that split-second decision, where in fact what I do, which I think is reasonable, may actually be viewed by someone on the internet that has no law enforcement experience and no understanding of the complexities of the job as being unreasonable.
In the aftermath of the horrific ambush that took place 5 years ago, this July 7th, in downtown Dallas. I know Chief Brown said that police officers were being asked to do things that weren't part of their original job description. They were being asked to be, after school care for kids in a lot of respects, a lot of social work, taking care of the homeless population. Are we changing the job of police these days?
Yeah, there's no question, right? So if you look back at the history of law enforcement, I mean, even when Sir Robert Peel, was part of the Constabulary Act back in England in the day where law enforcement, was actually created in modern times, one of the things that we see is that, law enforcement was exactly that, to enforce the laws. And it was there to keep order. It was there to keep sort of the balance in our society. And that job has evolved. In some cases, it has evolved to include and meet some of the needs in society over the past 100 years, I would say, in the United States. But more recently, it's continued to evolve. Some people are instinctive in calling 911 for any issues that come up. I remember when 9/11 took place, almost 20 years ago now, hard to believe, but I remember soon after 9/11, people were calling 911 because they thought they were putting anthrax on airplanes and dropping it off in various places here in the Metroplex. And what we found out was that people were calling because they had seen spider web, somewhere, and they thought that somehow that was anthrax. And so here you have law enforcement, taking their time to go address that need from the community. Imagine the thousands of dollars that are being spent on the officer's salary, the maintenance of the equipment, the vehicle, the gas, and more than anything, tying up the 9/11 lines for things that, didn't really matter in the big picture, but versus those items where law enforcement absolutely had to respond to. So I would say, yes, I mean, we're asking cops to be social workers, to be psychologists, to be pet owners, to be advisors, to be counselors, and then to enforce the law from time to time.
I think you'll appreciate this. My mom used to always say whenever I would be whining about something, necesitas poner de tu parte. Like, whatever your problem is, you need to do your part to help solve it. Especially if you're praying to God, you need to do your part as well. You can't just depend on the prayer, even though it's important. What would you like to see neighborhoods do to help fight crime in their area, to help police do their job? In other words, poner de su parte.
I think that crime is an incredibly complex subject for most people to really fully understand, in the sense that it is only counted in certain instances. So, that's the reason why we're moving from the UCR to NIBRS, which is a far better system that the FBI has required law enforcement to report through. But at the end of the day, crime doesn't go away unless the community is involved. Law enforcement can only do so much. Most of what you see around the Metroplex and the rest of the nation is law enforcement. They'll saturate. We call it saturation. They'll send police units to a certain corner. They'll respond quicker in certain cases, just to be able to let the bad guys know that crime will not be tolerated. Those are what we call suppression strategies. They will suppress the crime up to a certain level, but at some point, law enforcement has to pull out of those areas in order to address the other issues that are facing the cities. And so they don't have the capacity, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources to stay there constantly. And so it really does take the community. It takes the community to engage in dialogue with law enforcement, to provide law enforcement with good intelligence, to also prevent the opportunity to have crime in their neighborhoods, and also to report people that they know are engaging in criminal activity, so that there's what we call zero tolerance in those particular areas. It is not until the community is involved, regardless of how great the programs may be coming out of law enforcement entities and cities, regardless how much money is spent by them. At the end of the day, it takes the community in conjunction with the law enforcement entities to be able to move crime or push crime away. We often say in criminology that crime really never goes away. It just moves from one jurisdiction to the next. For it is, in fact, an issue that has feet and often moves. And so what you want to do is make sure that your community shows a zero tolerance for crime, so that you can walk your dog at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so you can get on your bicycle and ride your bike at night and not fear for your life, as unfortunately some of our communities that are experiencing crime right now are in fact engaging in that type of fear.
And by working with police, you're creating communication with them, a relationship with them, and then they're not viewed as the enemy. They're viewed as someone helping to make your community safer, your neighborhood safer.
Exactly, and we have to do our part, right? Which is what you said in Spanish, which translates to English, which is the idea that you've got to do your part. You have to be able to. We have to own this, right? This is not a social problem that has to be addressed by law enforcement exclusively. This is a problem that is created by society members, and it has to be addressed by members of our society in conjunction with our courts, with our correctional system, and with law enforcement. But, cops are, I've always said this, and I have a lot of experience working with them, and I've always been, try to be fair in my statements about a police incident that happens. I've worked on two of the largest police reform cases in the United States, currently still work on one of them. And I will tell you, as someone that has seen a lot, is that law enforcement, for the most part, are made up of honest, decent, hardworking people that are out there to make a difference in people's lives. They're risking their own lives. We have a handful of them, as every other profession does, that does not belong in the ranks of law enforcement. And my job as a criminologist is always to try to help them, the law enforcement entities, get rid of those folks, perhaps even before they come in to the ranks of law enforcement. But at the end of the day, it is up to people to work with them. Cops are part of the community. Members of law enforcement have roots in the communities that sometimes they oversee and patrol. So we have to work with them, not against them. We have to stop the rhetoric. We have to stop the negativity. And we have to say, look, we really need each other in order to be able to address the crime picture. Because if we don't, if we look the other way and we let them think that somehow they're the enemy and they're part of the problem, I will tell you that what I predict is that this crime index is going to get way out of hand, even more so than what it is right now, and we're going to have a very tough fall. You think the summer is going to be tough? Wait till the fall comes in with all of these issues in front of us and with communities far removed from engaging with the law enforcement community and vice versa.
My guest once again on the phone today, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, an associate dean and professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Dr. Del Carmen trains officers coast to coast. He's also the author of the book, Racial Profiling in Policing, Beyond the Basics. And, there's been a lot of talk about racial profiling over the years. And some people say, well, it's needed. And other people say, well, it's bad. And for social justice reform, we need to have our eyes open that not everybody who looks like they could be a criminal is a criminal. Can you go a little bit more in depth into what your book is trying to teach?
Yeah, so, I've been doing research, as you know, and training police officers of racial profiling now for a little bit over 24 years, and I can tell you I've learned a great deal. One of the things that I go back to often, and in my book I make this case from the beginning, is that we have to look at science, right? This has been an issue that has been politicized quite a bit. We've seen that in the presidential elections, in the local elections. There's a lot of passion, coming from both ends, the minority community as well as the law enforcement community. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Nicaragua. I came to the States when I was 14 years old, and I can tell you as a first-generation Hispanic that racism does happen, right? It is part of what we see every day, unfortunately, in our society, and police officers are not exempt from engaging in racism. But the question really is, to what degree do they engage in racism, and how can we prevent that from happening or identify those officers that do engage in racial profiling? And so the answer is complicated, as you can imagine, but it is part of it is the use of data. I believe that data does show not necessarily who they stop, but who the officers are searching, what the outcome of those searches are, and whether or not the search was justified, right? So we look at that factor. We also look at social media. Oftentimes, racist police officers, as I often say, are typically ignorant, and their ignorance transposes to being very active in social media. So you'll see that they'll post comments on social media about different races or different individuals, and then you also see that many of them make their voices known in the locker room or in the gym or in various other areas along with other cops. So oftentimes There is institutional knowledge of these individuals. Oftentimes you find that the data is actually there and that the complaints have been made, but no one's paid attention to it. You look at Chauvin in the case of George Floyd last year. He had over 15 complaints that have been filed against him in the course of his 16 or 18-year career. That's extraordinary, right? I mean, even if the complaints were unfounded, you typically don't have officers have complaints against them at a rate of 1 or 2 complaints a year in each year of their service. And so somebody should have paid attention to that. Somebody should have noted the fact that this is an incident, and he already had an incident, which in fact the Justice Department is looking at prior to Mr. Floyd's death, where his use of force was also challenged. And so when you look at that and you say, typically these officers that are engaging in excessive use of force or racism don't just do it overnight. You know, these are officers that are, you know, they make this a hobby and their daily activity. And so there is a pattern there. It's just a matter of looking in the right place and being able to identify it early on.
We only have a minute or so, but I know that more and more police departments are training police officers to intervene when their fellow officers use excessive force or engage in other misconduct. And it's active bystandership for law enforcement. Are you teaching that in your classes right now, Dr. Del Carmen?
We are, but that's something that we've taught for years, right? So I want to make sure that your audience understands this. Yeah, I know that that's a catchy phrase now, and everyone's talking about it, you know, intervention of, you know, in situations here and there. But at the end of the day, police officers have been told and taught to do that since the academy years, you know, 20, 30 years ago, some of the ones that have been around for a while. So it's nothing new. It's not a new concept. It's just been redesigned by some people that are out there profiting from it and making money. But in reality, at the end of the day, police officers should know that already when they graduate from the academy. So it's a good reminder, but I'm not so optimistic that somehow this is a revealing new concept that cops are going to benefit from in years to come.
What is the trait you most like to see in a new police officer, someone that's studying law enforcement? Integrity.
And I mean, I would obviously, integrity is one of the most important things that we love to see in police officers, particularly, and we call integrity, you know, doing the right thing when no one's looking, you know, and it's the idea that you're always going to be on the right path of history and also ethics. But I tell you, as an organization, I would love for police organizations to be able to hold them accountable as well, because some of them have great policies, have great training, but there is a flaw in the accountability factor from management onto the local police officer out there patrolling the streets. And so we want to see more accountability. We want to see integrity being taught and enforced since day one. And we also want to see the community understanding the complexities of law enforcement, for it is a difficult job and they need the community support.
Dr. Alex Del Carmen, an Associate Dean and Professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.